about that. Okay, great. We are officially recording. So for today's class, I'm going to talk about evaluative research. It's kind of the last step in the campaign proposal process that we take up. It's essentially our opportunity to prove to the client whether or not our campaign was successful, and if it wasn't, what are some areas that we can improve upon. In the actual, like in an actual campaign situation, you would conduct additional research after the campaign is done or throughout the duration of the campaign. For you guys, you don't have to conduct what we call evaluative research, but you do have to create an evaluative research plan, which I'll talk about later on in the section 2 video that will be posted tomorrow. So no need to get stressed out about conducting more research. The only research that you guys have to conduct is the market research. Evaluative research is just something that we think about towards the end of the campaign proposal process. Before we get into all of that, I want to go ahead, go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can see what I am seeing as well. All right, so as a reminder, if you haven't already done so, make sure that you respond to the 2 discussion posts. That is due tonight. I haven't yet graded them, as you guys can see on my to-do list. But the first response was just basically me checking in with you guys to make sure you're doing relatively okay given the situation that we're in, and then your feedback in terms of what professors can do to assist you guys. And then the second discussion post was your response to the announcement video that I sent out last Friday that does a really good job of outlining, the major changes that are taking place in our class as a result of the COVID-19 situation. And I see that we have to add one more person. Okay, great. So make sure you guys respond to both of those by tonight at 11:59 p.m. What I want to bring your attention to is in the discussions section, I do have what I call like an exam to review question discussion post. So after today's lecture, or actually during the lecture, after I finish lecturing, I will open up the class to any questions that you might have. Just pose them in the chat. However, if you find yourself maybe later on today or throughout the weekend studying and you need clarification over a concept or just the format of the exam, go ahead and pose those questions on the discussion post that's titled, again, Exam to Review Questions. The only reason why I kind of want you guys to do it that way is because someone in my other class brought to my attention that if you guys were to ask your questions in the form of a discussion post, other students can benefit from it because, again, you guys can see what questions are being asked. So again, after today's class, if you do have any questions specifically about the exam, go ahead and post those there so that other folks can see it. And then I'll talk more specifically about the exam again after I lecture, but I want to make sure I'm going to go ahead and get started there with the actual content. And the slides are already posted on Canvas for you in the same week's module under the live lecture link. So yes, let's go ahead and get started. Like I just stated, so evaluative research is the research that we conduct towards the end of our campaign. Right as soon as we implement those campaign tactics, we kind of monitor whether or not they're going well. And if not, how can we improve upon those efforts? And sorry, I'm just adding a few more folks. So in terms of what I'm going to be discussing in today's class, what specifically do I mean by evaluating? So in other words, what are we evaluating in the campaign? When do we do this? So I might have been a little misleading just now. We actually evaluate the campaign throughout the duration of it. So not just at the very end, but at the beginning, middle, and end. And then how exactly do we do this? So what type of metrics or tools or data analytics do we use in order to get that data for evaluative research? So before I get into all of that, I do want to establish the imperative nature of doing evaluative research. I cannot stress enough how important it is. The client, at least from a real-world agency standpoint, they are generally going to want some type of proof that what we're doing has the potential to work, or that we are at least trying to monitor the successfulness of our campaign. And I think that stems from the fact that public relations as an industry, we're constantly proving our value to business owners. Oftentimes, business folks, they don't think about PR until a crisis takes place, right? So they don't view public relations as a fundamental, business function, again, until some type of reputational or relationship crisis takes place. So with that being said, evaluative research kind of serves as a cool way to prove what we're doing matters, in that it does in fact have an impact on their campaign efforts. And then we also want to make sure that whatever it is that we're implementing, that again, we're monitoring it. And then if for whatever reason it doesn't go as well as we want it to, we can provide some type of analysis to demonstrate to the client how we can improve in the future. So once more, that's the important nature of evaluative research. It proves that what we're doing provides value to the business, and it proves that, whatever they're investing in our PR agency, it's worthwhile, and that we're actually monitoring these campaign communications. Okay, so what exactly are we evaluating? That's the first thing I want to talk about, the first broad category I want to talk about. So what I mean by evaluative research and what specifically we're evaluating, we got to go back to the objective statements. So once more, this is not one of those classes where you take an exam and you forget about the information that's on the exam, kind of like a disposable assignment, if you will. We are constantly applying everything that we've learned since the very beginning of the semester to this campaign proposal. So hopefully you guys didn't forget too much about what I mean in reference to campaign objective statements. So if you guys recall, we had 3 types of objective statements. We had awareness, action, and acceptance. So awareness is all about whether or not people are familiar with our brand. Do they understand what we're about? Acceptance, or more so like what type of impact do we want to have on the attitudes of our audiences. And then finally with action, this is when we want to have an impact on the behavioral response or the behaviors of our audiences. So with that being said, how can we evaluate whether or not we are successful in our objective statements, whether or not we accomplish those objective statements? One of the reasons why I told you guys it's so imperative that your objective statements are measurable, that you have some type of metric, in that objective statement, is because we use that, pre-campaign metric to compare it to, post-campaign metrics and data to figure out whether or not there was any change in terms of impact that we've had in our key audiences. So with awareness objective statements, what we're evaluating is, again, whether or not people understand our campaign message, whether or not they understand our brand in general, who we represent. Do they recognize our brand? And more importantly, can they remember who we are and what we're all about? And then with attitude or acceptance objective statements, this is when we're essentially evaluating what type of effect did our campaign message have on our key audience's attitudes, not only in terms of about the client, but maybe just about the campaign message in general. And then action, that's pretty straightforward. This is when we're looking at whether or not our campaign efforts had an impact on the audience's actions. So whether that's consumer behaviors, so did they increase or did they buy more products from our business? Did they come to some of our events more often? So that's what we're looking at, and that's what we're evaluating when we are evaluating action objective statements. And then my last point there, I think it's kind of important to take into consideration some unintended effects of a public relations campaign or any type of communication campaign for that matter. But that's hard because it's not intended. And one really, I guess you can say, tangible example of that is, of course, we have L Brands here in Columbus, Ohio, and they originally owned Victoria's Secret, not anymore. But there's a wealth of research that shows that when young women in particular are exposed to images of other women who are very thin, tall, the typical Victoria's Secret image, if you will, that actually makes a lot of young women feel insecure or less confident about their body. And so I'm sure the folks at Victoria's Secret, when they're designing their ads, they're not thinking to themselves, how can we make young women feel really bad about their bodies? At least I hope not. But nevertheless, that is an effect sometimes of viewing those advertisements. So how can communication experts and professionals take those unintended effects into consideration? One way, at least in my opinion, that they can do that is by conducting research on diverse audiences, not just their typical, audience that they think might be interested in their product, making sure they have all genders represented perhaps in the market research, all races, things of that sort, just to make sure that, there isn't backlash, in reference to the communication message. So, yep, that's what we're evaluating when we talk about evaluative research, our objective statements: awareness, action, and acceptance objective statements. Questions over that? All right, no. Okay, and the second thing I'd like to talk about is when exactly do we do this evaluative research? Once more, as soon as we implement our tactics, ideally speaking, we should start, evaluating the progress of those tactics. And so first, starting with at the beginning, how do we evaluate, our tactics at the very beginning of the campaign? One really easy way to do that is to compare your post-campaign data with your benchmark data. And a really easy way to, get that data is through the form of market research. So let's say, for example, there are only 200 people in Gahanna who know about fake cakes, and we want to double that amount So we want to make it to 400 people in Gahanna who know about fake cakes. So we would then essentially compare our pre-campaign data, our benchmark data in the form of market research, and compare it to another survey that we would conduct after the campaign is completely done, and see if there's been any change between the two sets of data, if you will. And then also you can conduct case studies depending upon what you are looking at within your campaign. But market research is probably going to be the easiest way to collect that benchmark data. And once more, benchmark data is the data that you collect before you actually implement your campaign tactics. That will be on the exam, so that's why I kind of further define that. So benchmark data is essentially the research, probably market research, that you conduct before you implement the campaign tactics. And then we have what's called an implementation report. So an implementation report is essentially when you send a very I think a page or so synopsis in terms of, or to the client, to describe how well were those, tactics executed so far in the campaign at the very beginning. It's really important to do this. I have been in campaigns where that step is missed, but it provides a sense of assurance, I guess you say, or reassurance to the client that we're really monitoring these tactics and we're making sure that they are going well. And if they're not, for whatever reason, we have enough time to kind of adapt our communication strategy to make sure long-term at least, or at least throughout the duration of the campaign, that they go according to plan. So that's what we do at the very beginning of evaluating the campaign. Any questions over that? All right. Next up, we have at the middle. So again, we evaluate our tactics throughout the implementation process, and that includes in the middle of it. So very similar to those progress reports that we received in elementary and middle school and even high school, the same is going to happen here. So we essentially conduct and create progress reports to figure out whether or not our tactics are still going as planned, and figuring out whether or not the response is in line with what we had hoped it would be. So what does that look like tangibly? Like, how do we evaluate something at the very, middle of the campaign? One way to do that is through, conducting surveys on the audience that you're targeting, making sure their response once more is in line with what you had hoped it would be pre-campaign, looking at attendance figures if you're trying to put on an event or of some sort, looking at sales figures, mid, campaign or during that mid-campaign moment. If you want to figure out whether or not your client is getting more media exposure, one easy way to do that is through impressions. And so later I'm going to define impressions, but actually I'll go ahead and do it right now. So impressions are basically a metric that we use to figure out how many folks were exposed to our message. I really want you guys to pay close attention to the word exposure, right? Because exposure doesn't necessarily mean that I've engaged with your message. So I could be exposed to a tweet, for instance, that's, in my timeline or in my feed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to like it. That doesn't mean I'm going to read it. I might have probably just scrolled right past it and honestly didn't even notice that that was a tweet from, so-and-so. So I want you guys to make sure that you know the difference between impressions and engagement. And I'll, bring up another example as well a little bit later on, but that will definitely be on the exam as well. And then finally, at the end, of course, we want to wrap up our evaluative research by conducting more research at the very end of the campaign. And very similar to what we did at the very beginning of the campaign, where we, create an implementation report, what we're going to do here is create a final report. So how did everything go? What were some things that we really did well on in terms of accomplishing? And what were some things that perhaps we could have improved upon, and some learning lessons? Oops, seems like someone was trying to get in, but not sure what happened. All right, so yes, that's what we do at the very end of the campaign. All right, and so that leads me to my final point here, but I'm gonna spend a little bit time unpacking this because I feel like this is where I might lose some people. How do we evaluate our objectives? That largely depends upon the objective type. So what I'm going to do right now is go through how do we evaluate acceptance objective statements, for example. How do we evaluate awareness objective statements? And how do we evaluate action objective statements? So before I get into the actual methodologies that we might use, these are some guiding questions for you all that I think will be really useful for your own campaign proposal that you'll turn in at the end of the semester. So if you're talking about your awareness objectives and you're trying to figure out whether or not you've accomplished those objective statements, those awareness objective statements, I should say, ask yourself these questions. So how many people actually saw your message, right? Did they comprehend the overall point, or was it confusing? Was it too distracting? And more importantly, after they were exposed to that message and actually saw it, can they recall it from memory? I think that last question is a little more important, in my opinion at least, compared to exposure, right? Because it's one thing to see a message, but if it's not memorable, it's not going to have, a more enduring impact in terms of, cultivating that brand loyalty and that brand engagement. So those are just some questions you might want to ask when you're trying to figure out how do we evaluate our awareness objectives in particular. All right, so what are some of the methods, the concrete methods that you guys can use to evaluate your awareness objective statements? So if you're trying to increase, for example, news coverage about the client, so let's say you want to have, an impact on the awareness among Columbus professionals, young professionals in particular, age 24 to 35, and you want to make sure there's more newspaper articles in the specific publications that they read. So one thing that you can use is what's called a clipping service. So a clipping service is basically a media monitoring service that tracks how many articles have been written about your client in a specific time frame. What are those articles about? So is it more so about the product, the owner, the employees, maybe a crisis that they went through? So it's not just the amount of articles, it's also the actual quality or the content of the articles as well. We could, as publicists and marketing pros, we can conduct our own, content analysis, because that's essentially what a clipping service does for businesses. They conduct, a content analysis for folks, and they, give them the data, and they tell them what they found, basically. But we can do that on our own, but depending upon our resources and what's available to us, from a PR agency standpoint, we actually might want to hire someone else to do that work. So again, once more, a clipping service is essentially a media monitoring service that tracks any type of news coverage about your client or about, something related to your client. Media impressions, once more, that's just exposure, the pure exposure that, an audience might have to your message. And then whether or not people understand that message. One really easy way to determine whether or not people understand your message is to conduct a really, quick survey or even a focus group if you have that time. So again, that's one way that you can figure out whether or not people, can adhere to and really understand your message content. So I believe on my next slide here, I want to rest on this point because the example I'm going to show you guys in just a second and take you guys through really does a good job of showing the differences between impressions versus engagement. So I'm using my own tweet as an example. So last year I delivered a TED Talk, an amazing experience, by the way, and it's one of my pinned tweets I have up here. So anyone who's on Twitter, and I think the same goes for Instagram, if I'm correct here, you can have access to the social media analytics on the back end. So this tweet that I have about my TED Talk, it received almost 10,000 impressions. So in other words, this was exposed to maybe, 10,000 people, or the times I should say it was exposed to people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they saw this tweet. It could have very well been in their feed, but again, they could have very easily scrolled past it, right? Just because someone retweets something doesn't mean that someone else is going to pause, right, and look at it and really engage with it. In fact, speaking of engagement, as you guys can see here later on, the engagement level compared to impressions is substantially lower. So the engagement basically is only 504 times. In terms of how they're defining engagement, in terms of Twitter, how they're defining it, so how many people liked the tweet, how many retweets did I receive, how many folks maybe clicked on my profile as a result of that, share, how many people actually clicked on the TED Talk, right, and watched it, and how many comments I received. So again, I think this, social media analytic is a really great example of how impressions should not be conflated with engagement. Those are two separate concepts. Obviously, you need to be exposed to a message in order to engage with it, but don't think to yourself just because someone is exposed or someone has seen a message that it's interesting to them, that they are motivated to engage with that message. So definitely think about that in light of some of your own evaluative research methods that you will need to think about for your campaign proposal. I'm going to go ahead and stop here again. Any questions over that? How do we evaluate? What metrics and methodologies do we use to evaluate awareness objective statements? Okay. Next, going on to acceptance objective statements. So again, this is when we're trying to figure out what type of impact did our message have on our audience's attitudes and their opinions. And so how will we do that? How do we measure an attitude? There are scholars who really think about this because an attitude is a psychological construct. How do we get that down to some type of number? I mean, that's very, very hard if you want to go about it in that way. Sorry, there's someone else who is, yep, okay. So some methodologies that we might want to consider when we're trying to figure out the impact of our message on our audience's attitudes. Again, we can conduct another survey at the very end of our campaign. And we compare that post-campaign survey data to our market research to see if there's been any change in attitudes. Now, ideally speaking, we would like to survey the same people that we surveyed in the market research just to be a little more reliable, right? I'm sure you guys have talked about that, reliability versus validity in the research methods course. Ideally, we would want that to happen. Does that always happen in the PR marketing industry? Sometimes yes, most of the time actually it does, but sometimes no. And then we might want to look at whether or not we had an impact or if there's any change in Google reviews, Yelp reviews. However, I should have probably put a little asterisk by that because you can't go to a client from a research standpoint, I'll say that. You can't go to a client and say, our campaign efforts had an impact or it caused an increase in positive Yelp reviews. The reason why that's the case is because it's more so of a correlation versus causation. And once more, going back to the research methods class that I'm sure some of you guys have taken or are currently taking, correlation and causation are two completely different things. So you can say that there is some association going on here, but you can't say that your campaign alone caused the change in the online reviews because we can't control for those external variables. We would do that in the form of an experiment. And typically in marketing and public relations, we don't conduct experiments like you might see in academic research. And then also we can look at some of the social media discourse online, whether or not we're generating more conversation and what does that conversation look like? What specifically is that buzz all about? Is it negative, positive? And even beyond that, is it about the product? Is it about the business owner? Is it about, our stance on a particular social issue? So we could look at that as well in terms of figuring out what type of impact we've had on people's attitudes. So that's how we evaluate acceptance objective statements, primarily through the form of post-campaign surveys or post-campaign focus groups. We can also look at, how people are talking about us online, but we can't necessarily assert causation. So that'll be really important for you guys to know for the exam as well. All right, and then the last thing in terms of how we evaluate action objective statements, I think this is probably the easiest for students to understand. Action objective statements in general are pretty, straightforward and clear cut. So what type of behavioral impact do we have on the audience? And so we would look at, for example, whether or not there's an increase in sales. Are people buying our product more? Are people coming to our store more? So we can track that, the foot traction, or foot traffic, I should say. There's a lot of different tools and gadgets out there to track that. We can look at attendance figures, right? So whether or not people are actually coming to our events, and again, coming to our store. If we're coming at this from a nonprofit angle, do we have more, donations from, folks in the community? Have we sustained those operations in terms of those donations? So again, these are just some of the things that we might want to consider when we're trying to figure out from a methodological standpoint, whether or not we've achieved our action objective statements. So I want to go ahead and pause here and kind of recap what I've talked about so far. So I talked about, what exactly are we evaluating in this, phase of the campaign process? We're evaluating our objective statements and whether or not we've actually accomplished those objective statements. That's why it's so important that you make sure that those statements are measurable. They have some type of metric so that you can, in fact, conduct this evaluative research. Then I talked about, when do we do this evaluative research? So we do it as soon as we implement our campaign tactics. So at the beginning, middle, and at the end. And then finally, how do we do that? What are some methodologies that are available to us that we can use to essentially conduct this evaluative research? There's so many, but it really depends upon the objective statement type. So if it's awareness, we might want to look at a clipping service, depending upon whether or not we're looking at media awareness. If it's, people awareness in terms of whether or not people are aware of our brand, we could look at, post-campaign surveys, post-campaign focus groups, things of that sort, and also impressions. For our acceptance objective statements, same thing, post-campaign survey or post-campaign focus groups. And then with action objective statements, we can look at a ton of things. Sales, whether or not people are coming to our store, whether or not, people are actually engaging with us in some capacity. So these are some of the things that will definitely not only be on the exam, but also will be really applicable to your campaign proposal. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about before we maybe discuss the exam in more detail is going back to the PESO model that we discussed last class. So some of you guys might already be thinking about using this PESO model to propose some media tactics in your campaign proposal. So if we're looking at paid media, how do we evaluate whether or not our paid media is working to our advantage, is in line with our campaign objective statements and our overall campaign goal? Now we could outsource this, and what I mean by that is we could, work with a local ad agency to look at some of, their metrics that they're using to evaluate, the frequency and reach of our ad campaign, for instance, if we are putting on an ad campaign. Now, keep in mind, in public relations, we tend not to use paid media, but let's say that we wanted to use like paid promoted posts, for instance, on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. They could still help us out with that, or we could do it on our own through social media analytics if we're looking at paid social media posts. If we're talking about like more traditional advertising, we could look at Nielsen ratings, for instance. We could partner up with them, or we can use what are called HUT and PUT. For those who are taking media planning with Mary, you should cover this. So HUT just basically means how many homes are using television in a specific area and whether or not people are actually tuning in to the program that you put your TV ad in. And then persons using TV is what it kind of sounds like. So how many people within the demographic that you're targeting actually watch television or using it specifically or in a specific time frame, and whether or not they're tuning in the time that you've placed your ad. Now, with earned media, this is going to be a lot more relevant to a public relations campaign. Once more, if we want to try to make sure that we have more media coverage about our client, how do we evaluate whether or not that's been successful? Once more, you can use that clipping service to your advantage so that they can monitor how many times, the client is being mentioned and to what capacity or what exactly is the client being mentioned about. Again, with exposure, we can use impressions, but again, that doesn't lead to engagement. How many, readership, or how much is the readership if we're talking about newspapers, and whether or not that readership has changed a bit, throughout the duration of our campaign. And once more, looking at the commentary, in response to an article about our client. What does that look like? Is there any change? Because there might not be a change whatsoever. And depending upon what we're trying to accomplish, that could be a good thing or a not so great thing. And then the last two, media with the PESO model in terms of evaluating this shared media. So we're going to obviously look at, especially with social media, look at the analytics, the analytical tools that are provided to us for free in a lot of these platforms. So you can look at how many shares that your article received or that your post received. You can look at how many likes. You can look at what people are exactly saying, in response to the social media post. You can look at whether or not that post, from an ROI standpoint, return on investment, whether or not that's redirected people to, your main website, whether or not that has motivated people to actually visit, your storefront. So those are some of the analytics that we can use and tools that we can use to evaluate shared media. And then finally, with owned media, again, with a lot of these platforms, they already have analytical tools built in it. Google Analytics is a really popular tool that folks who are building websites or at least trying to track website behavior is used because it's free. Now, there are a lot of jazzy programs out there, but again, if you kind of want to go the simple, straightforward route, Google Analytics is definitely the way to go. If you are creating own media in a newsletter or in the format of a newsletter, MailChimp is also a really popular platform that's used to create, again, newsletters. And they have, data analytics built into their system as well. All right, so this chart that you see here is actually straight from your textbook, but I assume that maybe some of you guys no longer have access to the textbook, so I just took a screenshot of it. This chart. You don't necessarily need to memorize everything that's on here for the exam, but I think it's helpful in, taking a look at, because here I think it does a really good job of what am I trying to say? It takes, the evaluative research categories and splits it up, right? So if we wanted to look at whether or not we had an impact on exposure, well, what does that look like with owned media, shared media, earned media, and paid media? Because that looks very different depending upon the media type. We wanted to look at engagement, whether or not we were successful in that capacity. That's going to look different. Whether or not, that engagement led to some type of, attitudinal change or behavioral change, right? So again, you don't necessarily have to remember this for the exam, but I definitely think this will be extremely useful for you guys for your paper. So make sure you just take a look at it at least. All right, so now what we're going to do, and like I said, I really wish I could see you guys because I think this would be a little more effective in person, but we're gonna try it here. I have 4 objective statements, 2 here, and then I'll go to my next slide. And I want you to put in the chat to basically figure out what kind of methods would we use to measure whether or not we accomplish these objective statements. So the first one reads, to have an impact on the awareness of current investors, specifically to enhance their understanding of Fate Cake's brand identity and products/services by 40% within 3 months. So what kind of method could we use to measure the investor's understanding of Fate Cake's brand identity? Go ahead and think about that for a few seconds and then put your answer in the chat. So how do we measure understanding? You guys can look back in your notes. So it has to do with how do we evaluate awareness objective statements. All right, so Haley put a post-campaign survey. Absolutely, we certainly could do that. Anyone else want to take a guess? So that's right. What's perhaps another method that we could use? It's not exactly similar to a survey, but it's another way to interview people post-campaign. So we could conduct a post-campaign focus group as well. So the second objective statement we have here, what method could we use to evaluate this one? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just now seeing the responses here. Volume data. Maggie, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If I'm understanding you correctly, maybe are you referring to like some data analytics? But I could be wrong about that. Ellen said a clipping service. So Ellen, the only way that we would use a clipping service in this objective statement is if we're trying to have an impact on media coverage. Remember, clipping services are only used when we're trying to monitor media coverage. And this particular objective statement has nothing to do with media coverage whatsoever. It has everything to do with the general understanding in terms of the investor's understanding of fake cakes. Now, if it said something like to have an impact on the action of, I don't know, Columbus Dispatch reporters, specifically to increase the amount of articles about fake cakes in the Columbus Dispatch, want to increase that by 4 articles within 2 months, then absolutely in that example, we would use a clipping service. So hopefully that clarifies things a bit. Let's see, Tori, I'm not sure if this is for the first or the second objective statement. If it's for the first one, then it would not be correct because investors aren't necessarily buying product. They're more so, again, funneling money to, sustain the financial operations of the business. Now, the second objective statement, depending upon how you're understanding that, I could potentially see how that might apply. But just to kind of clarify the second one, so to have an effect on the action of corporate sponsors, specifically to maintain a consistent annual donation. So what will we look at there? So in other words, what method could we use to evaluate the successfulness of that objective statement? How could we determine whether or not we had a consistent annual donation? Okay. Yep, Maggie, you're right. Yes. So for the second one, how can we determine whether or not we've had a consistent annual donation from corporate sponsors? What methods could we use? Or even, thinking outside of the whole method realm, what could we do? What would we do to figure out whether or not there's been a change or an increase? So what we could do, again, if we wanted to just figure out whether or not there's been a change whatsoever, we would just compare, the donations that we received the previous year to, the next year. Very good. So Jesse, that's basically what they wrote. Excellent. There might be a slight delay on my end, so my apologies for that, because now I'm seeing some responses come in. All right, the last two objective statements. So to have an effect on the acceptance, now remember, acceptance objective statements basically seek to have an impact on the audience's attitudes. So specifically, we're looking to see whether or not we can enhance positive attitudes towards Fake Cakes fundraising events. So we want people to feel more positively about these events that we're putting on at Fake Cakes. How can we determine whether or not there's been a change in attitude? What method could we use? And I think we kind of already touched on this in another objective statement. So it's okay if you say the same thing. Yep, so Tiara wrote post-campaign focus groups, absolutely. We can conduct a post-campaign survey. Jess said that, Tori said that, very good, excellent. And then the last one, to have an impact on the action of Fake Cakes employees. So specifically, we're looking at whether or not we can increase their engagement with the company newsletter. So I mentioned the type of tool that we could use to analyze newsletter engagement. What was that? What platform would we use? It's not the only one, I should say that, but it's one of the more popular ones. So the name of the platform that we use to typically create newsletters. Yes, very good, Jess. So we could use MailChimp data analytics to see whether or not there's been an increase in engagement, like opens, for instance, whether or not people are unsubscribing from our newsletter. Let's hope not, especially if they're employees. How many clicks do we get in terms of, like, let's say there's a link in our newsletter, how many folks or how many times was that link clicked on? So yes, we could definitely use like the platform's data analytics. All right, so that's all I have in terms of for lecture. That's actually my last like more formal lecture in terms of the content that's been covered in the book. The next few lectures will just be about preparing for the final paper and the final presentation and what that looks like, right, in an online environment. So now I want to go ahead and open it up to any questions that you guys might have about the exam that's coming up next Monday. Before I answer any questions that you might have, I just want to go over the format of the exam. So it is 30 questions. So it's basically the same format as the last exam. 30 questions, each of them are worth 2 points. And true, false, multiple choice, that's the format. I know in one of my like initial announcements, you know, back in mid-March, it seems like it's been forever, but that was only like a week and a half ago. When I thought we were only going to be doing this for 2 weeks, I said something about, you know, I've changed the exam format to where it was going to be some open-ended questions and some fill in the blank. That's no longer the case whatsoever. So it's just going to be multiple choice, true, false. And also it is open book. With that being said, it is timed as well. So it's an hour, or you have an hour to take the exam. If you are registered through ODS and you have, you know, a document that says that you need more time to take an exam, could you reach out to me in an email or on Canvas and forward that accommodation letter to me? All that information, honestly, is in my office, and so I no longer have access to that. So once more, if you are registered through ODS and you qualify for more time, please make sure you forward that information to me as soon as possible. The exam opens at midnight Monday. So midnight, 12 a.m. You can take it if you really want to. If you're staying up all night Sunday, and then, you know, you can just take it, you know, midnight Monday. And you have until 11:59 p.m., like the very last minute. There are no extensions, however, for the exam. I've changed my late policy for the written assignments a little bit, but for the exam, I cannot. Now, if you are going through something serious, let's say that, you know, unfortunately you get ill or one of your relatives is sick and you have to kind of step in for them, please communicate with me. Of course, in those egregious situations, I'll definitely make an accommodation. But if you just simply forget, unfortunately, I can't allow you to make up the exam. So proactive communication will definitely go a long way if you find yourself, you know, in a challenging situation. And I think that is it. So yes, open book, 30 questions. It's on Canvas. I don't know if I clarified that. You don't need an access code or anything. And once more, it is timed. It's an hour. So again, even though it is open book, as you guys know, in light of my last exam, my exams are very application based. There aren't going to be a ton of definitions there, so you still need to understand the concepts in order to apply it. I'm going to go ahead and let's see, can you guys see? Hold on. Oops. I just want to make sure you guys can see this. Yeah, you can. Never mind. Just kidding. If you guys go to this week's module, I do have an exam guide provided to you all, the very bottom. I'm not going to go through each of the concepts right now, but I will just briefly go through, again, what you will be responsible knowing for this upcoming exam. And I know you guys can't see that because I have to do a new share, which is annoying, but okay, so with the study guide, what you need to know for the exam is anything that we've covered after the first exam. And again, I know that seems like such a long time ago. So after I think the first exam, I lectured about market research. So you'll need to know the differences, for example, between qualitative and quantitative research. Why the heck do we even conduct market research in a communications campaign? What are some of the different methodologies that we went through? So a focus group, survey, content analysis, and how do we interpret data? And then you also need to know campaign strategies, broad campaign strategies. I talked about proactive and reactive. You will need to know all of the strategies that I discussed in that lecture. And that's primarily going to come from your lecture notes. I'm not sure if let me go ahead and look on the syllabus here. I know you guys can't see this, but for those who maybe need a little more guidance in terms of like when that lecture took place, I believe that was mid-February, the campaign strategies lecture. Let me go ahead and take a look here. So yes, if you guys look in your notes from Monday, February 24th, that's when I went over general campaign strategies. Then you guys will need to know, how do we frame campaign messages? What kind of appeals do we use? Logos, ethos, and pathos. And what does that practically look like? We did not finish up that lecture, so I will be posting those slides on Canvas as well. I will not post the slides for market research and campaign strategies because we've already went through that. We've completed those lectures. So, you should already have those notes with you. And then last class, of course, we went over the PESO model. So you'll need to know, what does PESO stand for? How are the different various media types different? What's the difference between controlled and uncontrolled media? I talked about that. Can you identify a situation where a media type can be both, for example, earned and shared media? I think the example that I gave last class is a press release can be considered owned and earned media. Owned because, whoever works for that company or whoever is, helping a client out, they're the ones who's writing that press release. So it's owned because someone within the company is writing it. However, it's used for earned media purposes. So we use this press release to secure media coverage, to announce something major that's happening within our company to a journalist. And then last thing, of course, that we talked about today, evaluative research. So you'll need to know all the different methodologies that we will use to, evaluate any given objective statement, whether that's awareness, acceptance, or action. And then, of course, the utility of evaluative research. And then also, this is kind of a side note, but still very much relevant to the exam. It's really important that you guys understand the difference between strategies and tactics. So I guess if I can use a football analogy, strategies are kind of like your game plan, that a coach sets up, and then your tactics are how well you actually execute that game plan on the field. So tactics are what we see, right? The strategy is the idea behind that tactic. So let's say that based upon your market research, right, because all your strategies have to be rooted in your market research finding. Let's say that you figure out that, Fake Cakes needs to enhance their audience engagement. So that's the strategy. We want to really enhance audience engagement on social media, for instance. Well, what does that look like? How are you going to enhance audience engagement? Well, we could do that through the form of a social media contest. We could do that through some type of Instagram, story that's really compelling, not just any Instagram story, right? Something that's very engaging to the audience. So hopefully that example I just gave to you guys helps to illustrate the key differences between strategies and tactics. Strategies are a little bit broader. They tend to be kind of vague. I wouldn't say vague, but they're more vague than tactics. We can actually see the tactic from the audience standpoint. And just in case that still did not make sense, I do have an example on Canvas. Let me see here. Just want to make sure I'm going to the right spot. Oh, it's actually in next week's module, if you guys jump down to week 13, I have an example. It's actually from a previous campaign proposal, a group who did a really good job of, basically writing their strategies and tactics out in a way that I think most people can realize, or at least detect the difference between their strategic standpoint and then their tactical standpoint in their campaign. All right, so what questions do you guys have for me about the exam, if any? It's okay if you don't have any. A lot is going on, to be honest with you. So if you don't have any questions, that's fine. So Ben wrote, do we need to install Proctorio, excuse me, for the exam, or is it like a Carmen quiz? So you don't need to install any of that system, and that's because we don't know what type of technological equipment that you guys have. We're scattered all over the state, all over the country, and even all over the world. So that's why for me, this is open book. So you don't need to install that whatsoever. It's just going to be on Carmen in the form of a quiz, but of course it's not a quiz. Good question. Any other questions that I can answer? No? All right, well, if that is all that you guys have, that's all I have for you all. Once more, as you're going through the study guide, if you do have more specific questions about something on that study guide, just make sure you pose those questions on the discussion post on Canvas. As always, thank you so much for sticking with me, and again, I'm sorry, since we have an exam next Monday, we don't have a live lecture, so the next time that we will see each other is next Wednesday. You guys take care and have a great weekend.